Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? We're making more progress on the coffee shop as every day goes by. We dealt with some insurance stuff this week. Insurance is not one of my favorite things, if I'm honest. It's paying for something you hope you never have to use, first of all. And if you do use it, then all the money you paid doesn't stop them from raising your rates. It's like you should have already paid for that usage when you have to use it. But then they're like, oh, well, you use it, so now we got to. It's a bit of a, I don't know. I don't want to call it a scam, but it just seems so unethical in a lot of ways. Uh, the American insurance industry, the healthcare industry, it's all set up to take advantage of people in a lot of ways. It feels like, and they're making way too much money for it to be too ethical. I mean, that's just a simple process of mathematics there, but. A couple quick things I want to dive in today. It won't be very long. We're listening to some great Lorraine Geller, who I mentioned a couple episodes ago, the wife of the great Herb Geller, and just a fantastic piano player. Real modern, post-bop era. She's got good deal of swing to her, honestly. She makes a few records with Herb, I think mostly over at Emersy, and then she has this record here on her own at Dot, which is it's a nice little label, you know. I have a nice little record. I mean, I really enjoyed it, but it's nice background music as well. So I find piano jazz to be, for the most part, the most piano trios are pretty universal in their setting, you know. And I think a guitar quartet has that same element. You can play those records anywhere for anybody, and rarely are they going to be too. Monk. Even in a trio setting, Monk can be a little challenging for the average person, but for the most part, piano trios are very accessible, very easy to listen to, and there's a lot of room for pocket and swing, which I like. Some horn players tend to overfill. You know, there's never that space to breathe. There's never that space for it to be a percussive pocket unit. But so regarding last episode I made on the MoFi controversy. Apparently I look smug and wry, and several people commented. Most people agreed with what I said. Most people, but they're probably because that's my channel's forte. Is kind of. I mean, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about music. But a few people were a little indignant with my comments. I think I was taken out of context by a few of those people. It's not that big a deal to me either way. You know what I mean? Like I said, I was made to ask the episode by several people. Like, why don't you chime in? Why don't you chime in by probably half a dozen people at least? And so I figured, well, you know, I didn't have an episode ready that morning. I'm like, let's just talk about that for a minute. And I apologize if I seemed a little bit gleeful. That wasn't my intent. It was just the irony, I think, of people who were so criticizing digital music to have been not be able to decipher themselves. And someone's like, well, it's not the same as a Dole record or a Wax Time record. And I never said it was. I'm not stupid, you know. I got a few MoFi records that sound good, you know. I don't have any that sound bad. I don't think most of my Scorpios sound that bad. And there's two other comments I want to add here, just on that subject, and we'll move on. Number one, people said, well, Wax Time and Dole isn't paying royalties to the artists or the families of the artists. And if you think that's the common thing to be done in jazz, you're very much drinking the Kool-Aid. Most jazz records artists were paid a one-time lump sum to come in that day and record. There was no royalties whatsoever. And I think some artists and some labels had a little bit more room for that. But across the board, from the great people like Norman Granz and the Blue Note cats, Alfred Frank, down to the more heelish type figures like the Herman Lubinskis and at Savoy, and even Norman Granz. You know, he had a real reputation for being, here's your payment. Think you get better somewhere else, and he paid them well compared to the small labels, but he was still very much a stickler of money and was pretty tight with it in a lot of scenarios. Royalties and residual, that didn't exist for black artists at that time. I remember Ray Charles came along and refused to sell his masters or to release the ownership of them, and he maintained most of the ownership of his music for most of his life. But that's also Brother Ray Charles, who had an esteemed, highly regarded career, who sold records to the likes of probably 10 times what the best jazz records were selling. Miles struggled to sell 500,000 copies at Columbia, and a few records have got up towards 1 million from my memory. But I think Sketches of Spain, Kind of Blues sold as probably his 2 best-selling Columbia records at the time. And of course, legacy sales aren't included in that fact. But it was the Chess brothers at Argo and Chess Records, Phil and Leonard. The reputation in the industry didn't allow for these black artists to sign contracts and to demand anything. For the most part, you were lucky to get into one of these white-owned recording studios, one of these white-owned labels, and to be able to put your music out there and to get a one-time fee. And Bob Weinstock at Prestige, people who were heroin junkies knew they could go to Prestige and get that one payment, go get their junk and get high. And I've seen payments ranging in what I've read over the years for session work from $50 probably to about $200, $300, $400, and sometimes I think I've seen a few that were $500 to $1,000 for some of these sessions and some of the leaders. This is in the 50s, mostly in the 60s. Those numbers probably start to change some, but again, it's a guy like Ray Charles in the late 50s who starts selling millions of records of Hallelujah, Love Her So, and What I'd Say, and a lot of that stuff. It was when Ray Charles started selling those records that he had that kind of leverage to really make that kind of a dictation. Louis Jordan sold a lot of records in the 40s, but I never heard of him having any ownership of those titles. And so that meant that Mercury and Columbia and the smaller labels, as they got sold and bought up by bigger labels, they were re-releasing that stuff for generations without the artist seeing a penny. I mean, and I've heard Tompo and some of the newer small campaigns here are trying to find some family people to give a token to. But let's be clear, these records are being pressed in the numbers of 5,000, and they're getting points on that are probably less than 1%. I mean, they're not paying anybody a ton of money to do this stuff. Any extra money is going in their own pockets, and the margins are already fairly tight with today's economics and demand and all the things going on. So to not buy a wax time because they're not paying royalties to any of the artists is a really silly argument that really, to me, has very little value. And it's just one of those things I think that they've made up to feel justified in their stance. And I've heard it said so many times by so many people, especially on the jazz Facebook groups. And I used to try to kind of debate people, but debating on Facebook is so pointless, I feel like. It's much different, I feel like, when I explain myself verbally on camera versus when I try to explain myself in a conversation typing. The level of disagreement and vitriol is just so much greater, and that's something I was really shocked by. I don't have near as much argument pushback on YouTube as I ever had on my YouTube groups, on my Facebook groups, sorry. So I think that one, it's great when artists' families can be found, but none of the artists are really alive to receive any of those value, that merit. Very few. And the money that they're receiving from any kind of that stuff, it's so inconsequential today from those little reissue because they're doing such small numbers. If you don't think if Tompo was doing 2 million copies of a record, that's when those numbers can kind of add up. But I'm guessing some of these families are getting $5,000 or something like that for something, which is nice. It's the right gesture and long overdue. But if we were to make a list of black musicians and artists from blues, from R&B, from soul, from jazz that didn't receive their proper economic reward, that would be a long list. And to not buy any of their records for that reason, I think in their minds they'd be like, it's about the music, man. If I was doing it for the money, I wouldn't have made such good music. Money was never my motive. My motive was to speak with my heart, my soul, and express my feelings and express my life story through this art form. And so the idea that someone's not buying my music today because they're worried that my descendants might not get paid. Those people who are the descendants of legacy artists, they have ways to probably manufacture income through museums and tours and things like that that may have some value and merit. But vinyl reissue programs, again, it's just not, from my understanding, something that's going to make anybody wealthy in today's day and age. The other thing I want to comment on regarding that hi-fi, mo-fi situation is, again, this goes far beyond mo-fi. It's just the hi-fi crowd in general. It's so often they'll talk about how much extra they heard, how much more was revealed to them once they went hi-fi, once they had the sound shape in the room and the speakers, and how much more they were able to pull from the music. And I'm calling bullshit on that for this reason primarily. If you're hearing more than the rest of us, where is that insight? Where is that commentary? Where is that feedback? Where is that channel saying, boy, this allowed me to dive that much deeper into the music and come up with all kinds of new revelations about what the music means and where it was from and the context of it? And where is that? I mean, I challenge any channel, anybody out there to say when they hear a record, they're hearing more than I'm hearing. And like I said in some of the comments, it's about the engagement of the listener. And sometimes these hi-fi guys are sitting there in that silent room with nothing distracting them, and that's going to enhance your listening process, period. It's about the empathy and the state of mind of the listener. I mean, a person who has empathy towards people who struggle is going to hear things in music that someone who is a proud nationalist flag waver and doesn't really care about any group but his own is never going to be able to decipher, no matter how great his speakers are. The empathy in the heart of the listener, the ability to comprehend what someone's trying to express and get across, your knowledge of the history and the context that art exists in, those are the things that are going to help you hear more and feel more in the music. That's why this channel exists. It's always been about me expressing things that the music made me feel through my PA speakers. You know what I mean? Through playing at clubs, through sound systems. I'm not ever sitting back in my hi-fi isolation booth going, oh, my spirit's it doesn't, for me, it doesn't work that way. It's something just strikes me. The consciousness, it's just like, oh, the throat grabber. It just grabs you by the throat and reminds you that, man, this guy is saying something from his soul. What's the soul trying to tell me? And it doesn't require hi-fi to have that. It requires empathy. It requires the state of mind of the listener being open to the artist that they're listening to and what that person's trying to lay down, where that person comes from. If you think being from the south side of Chicago and being a young soul singer in the Impressions in the 60s is the same experience as some white cat who grew up in the south of France or in a mansion in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like, there's different lifestyles that provoke an imprint on the art that they make. And so diving into that stuff and having some comprehension of that being, that setting, that who that person is, that's the more important aspect of hearing deeper into the music. And so whenever I hear someone say, oh, this helps me hear the music deeper and better and connect with it, what did you hear? Reveal it to me. Share with me what my ears didn't comprehend, what my soul, my heart, my empathy isn't picking up. I mean, some of these guys should be speaking about nothing beyond what that music impacted me and how it made me feel and sent shivers on my spine. But they're not. They're talking about their speakers and their cartridge and their amps and their tubes and their cables. But you're supposed to be hearing more. If you got things in the plot of Tom Sawyer that I missed because my copy didn't have it written out clearly enough, please tell me what I missed. If I watched David Lynch's Lost Highway and left scratching my head and going, I didn't know I missed the director's cut. What did I miss? And yes, Lost Highway, if you don't walk away from that scratching your head a little bit, you probably need some good medication. That movie's very disjointed, and it takes a few watches to even have some kind of grasp of what it's trying to tell you. And I love David Lynch. I think Twin Peaks changed television in so many ways. to put a filmmaker, an independent filmmaker, in charge of a network television program, and to have that storyline, which I don't want to ruin it for anybody in case anybody hasn't seen Twin Peaks. It's one of the greatest shows ever. It's daytime television soap meets, an adventure series, but it's set in the Pacific Northwest. But there's a darkness and an undercurrent to it that is shocking for network TV, and there's some things that happen in the show that are pretty shocking, mind-numbing stuff. And so, sure, great artists speak in code and speak in metaphor, and will allude to things and might have some hidden messages and significant metaphor. And if your hi-fi system is revealing this information to you, why don't you share it with the rest of us? And I think that's just why I call bullshit. You know what I mean? Because you're telling me you're hearing more, you're hearing it deeper, and yet there's not a lot of evidence of that. I mean, I feel like when I'm in tune with a record and I'm not distracted by doing something else, and I'm just sitting there and something grabs me, I feel like I can hear and feel and connect and almost speak with the artist on a level that, regardless of what speaker I'm listening to, that connection, that spirit, that connection of the consciousness, the human voice speaking to you of its struggle and its condition, and my openness to that condition, that struggle, kind of makes me go, oh, ooh, he's having a tough day or a tough time. And that's what makes my hair stand on end. That's what gets me excited. And I've sat in hi-fi listening rooms with many of my friends over the years, and it does sound great. But, I mean, I could turn this up, have a nice full low end, nice highs, mids, I can EQ things, so I can set my mids and highs where I want them, make my low end be nice and full and round. I mean, I don't think I have a problem with sound. Change my needles. Maybe not as often as I should, but I change my needles. I have 6 turntables, so it's tough to keep new sets of needles on all of my decks at the same time. But I try to keep my listening ones fairly fresh, and that's important, having good needles and cartridges to listen to and to dive into your records. But, so those are my only 2 statements today, I guess, really is, the royalty thing is not an issue in terms of my comprehension and belief systems. And if you're hearing more, please share us what we're missing. I think that would only be fair. Prove it to me. Show me something. Last time I talked about real quickly, Chick Corea, one of his early Blue Note sessions here with the great Blue Mitchell. And Blue Mitchell is one of those trumpet players who kind of gets a little underappreciated in today's day and age. He plays with Horace Silver for a long time. And his work with Horace Silver, to me, is just seminal stuff. Those records that they made, late 50s, early 60s, are just quality records in the hard bop, but meets some soul bop. I like that word. Let's make that up, soul bop. And that's kind of a great term for Silver, because he's never quite the hard bop of the Messengers and some of the other hard bop artists, even some of the guys that played with him, like Donald Byrd and Hank Mobley. Those guys make hard bop records. And there's certainly elements of hard bop in a lot of Horace Silver's records, but there's always a lot of rhythm and blues and soul bop going on. Nice little bit of a crossover genre there we're just going to create. So we have hard bop, we got cool bop, we got soul bop. And Blue Mitchell, great lyrical sound, not as percussive and rhythmic, and that pulsing nature of a Hubbard and a Clifford Brown. Those guys were really proficient and dexterous players. He's more Donald Byrd to Art Farmer in that range somewhere, with a soft tone, but it's got a melodic under key to it. Junior Cook plays on here with him, who, of course, also played with Horace Silver's band for a long time, with Gene Taylor, who also, I think, played with Horace Silver's band for a long time, and Aloysius Foster, I think it is, it's probably Aloysius Foster, who I don't know much about, to be honest. I listened to this record 3 times the other day while I was painting some trim for the coffee shop, and it's just a fantastic record. He spends years at Riverside while recording with Horace Silver at Blue Note. So he's making these great Blue Note records with Horace Silver But he's also making some great records as a leader at Riverside at the same time. And it's when he leaves Horace Silver and kind of runs out his contract at Riverside that he signs himself as a leader with Blue Note, and he makes another 6 or 7 records at Blue Note that are just outstanding. And his Riverside records are absolutely masterpieces as well. A few of those records he makes there are just some of the standards of the hard bop sound. And when he's not with Silver, he tends to lean more towards hard bop, post bop, modernity. He's not quite the soulful rhythm and blues guy that a Horace Silver is, and will shape every record that he plays on, being the piano player. So Blue Mitchell, 4178, probably 1962, 61. Not sure if it's going to say here anywhere. I doubt it. I don't think it does. But maybe 63 even. Looks like a fantastic session by just a great artist that I think doesn't get enough praise and recognition today. So that wraps up today's episode. I appreciate all the comments. I didn't have time to respond to everybody. I have a lot of stuff going on right now. But I'm looking forward to bringing the channel back once the cafe gets open. I'll be able to make more consistent episodes on a more regular basis. Right now it's a little bit sporadic. A lot of my YouTube revenues and demographics are trending down right now. But I made that episode the other day and everyone loved it. So y'all be safe. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Peace.